Concerns about transgender rights after 3 bills are passed by the state legislature.
The House has overridden the governor's veto.
Those laws targeting everything from school policies to medical treatments.
It's always shocking and it's always horrifying when you see grown human beings standing up and using the power of the state to hurt kids.
It comes at a time when the issue is dividing North Carolinians.
The state has an interest in protecting our children from long-term harm. That's what this bill is all about.
Tonight, we discuss the potential impact of those laws in a News 13 Roundtable. Hello and welcome to the News 13 Roundtable, Shifting LGBTQ Laws. Tonight, we'll focus on 3 controversial new laws in North Carolina and their impact on the LGBTQ community.
And tonight, we'll hear from Buncombe County Commissioner Jasmine Beach-Ferrara, Allison Scott with the Campaign for Southern Equality, and Shanna Peele with the Buncombe County Association of Educators. They'll join us in just a few minutes to discuss the impact of the new laws.
First, though, let's take a closer look at those laws and a similar bill that sparked backlash in 2016.
The political battle over transgender rights in North Carolina first made headlines with the so-called bathroom bill back in 2016. HB 2 required transgender people to use the public restroom that corresponds with the sex on their birth certificate.
North Carolina is a position now where we could potentially lose millions of dollars.
Many major events pulled out of the state in response to the new law. It was later repealed after public backlash.
No hate in our state!
Now, the issue has reemerged with the passage of 3 bills impacting the LGBTQ community.
The motion to override the governor's veto of House Bill 574 passes.
House Bill 574 bans transgender students from participating in women's school sports. House Bill 808 bans gender-affirming care for people under 18 years old. And SB 49 is known as the Parents' Bill of Rights, or the Don't Say Gay law.
We probably aren't as used to notifying parents when our students may share that type of information with us, particularly when it comes to pronoun changes.
The law requires educators to notify parents if their children would like to use a different name or pronoun.
It feels kind of like a remnant of like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, but, attacking trans students.
It also bans instruction about gender identity and sexuality in K through 4 classrooms and creates new processes for parents to challenge textbooks. Local schools are still working out how to implement those policies.
In October, a lawsuit was filed challenging House Bill 808 by Lambda Legal and the National Health Law Program.
They claim the law is discriminatory and harmful to transgender youth.
Those laws passed despite a veto by the governor, opposition from Democratic lawmakers, and concerns from the LGBTQ community.
And here's a look at why Republicans were determined to pass these bills. Protecting female athletes, protecting children, and giving parents more of a say in schools. Those are all arguments made by state Republican lawmakers who support the new laws.
Life-saving medication is epinephrine, atropine, things that will restart your heart. This is a choice.
State Representative Mark Pless co-sponsored House Bill 808, which bans gender-affirming care for people under 18. Here's why he says the new law is important.
Under the age of 18, they can't even get a tattoo. So if they can't decide to get a tattoo, they shouldn't be cutting off their genitalia.
And Senator Kevin Corbin co-sponsored Senate Bill 49. Here's why he supports the bill.
There's been a move out there to start teaching and introduce these things, sexuality, to children that are kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. Not in my district, but I did sign on as a co-sponsor because I believe in the basics of this bill.
Republican State Senator Amy Gailey says it gives parents more oversight.
Relationships between students and teachers are not confidential, and they should not be. That blows my mind that would even be controversial.
Corbin is also a main sponsor of the Senate bill version, which bans transgender students from participating in women's school sports, and he says the bill reinforces the importance of Title IX. And we invited several Republican lawmakers to participate in this roundtable, but they declined to participate.
Representative Mark Pless agreed, but could not make it due to scheduling conflicts.
Democrats have been pushing back against efforts to pass those laws all year. In this exchange, Republican State Senator Vicky Sawyer and Democratic State Senator Natasha Marcus argue over House Bill 574.
It might make other people a little uncomfortable, in some cases, but it's worth it.
I guess the young woman in Cherokee County who's still uncomfortable today from her neck injuries after a transgender male slammed her to the ground with a volleyball. Uncomfortable? Yeah, I call that uncomfortable.
Democratic lawmakers say those laws target the LGBTQ community.
And here's a look at why they're calling the bills discriminatory.
Democrats express frustration over laws they see as unnecessary. Senator Natasha Marcus saying House Bill 574 aims to fix a problem that doesn't exist.
Male athletes don't fake being transgender in order to get some sort of advantage by playing on female teams. That just doesn't happen. What we're talking about is the very small number of young people here in North Carolina who are really struggling with their identity.
Senator Marcus also had this to say about House Bill 808, quote, "You are attacking already marginalized kids and their families who do not want your opinion about their lives." Senator Jay Chaudhry says Republicans are focusing on the wrong issues.
Today's veto overrides are really just another example of fighting culture wars instead of fighting for our school children.
Senator Julie Mayfield saying this about the new laws.
These bills, in my view, are coming out of a place of hate. It is purely a political issue meant to score points with a base. And Democrats are not going to play that game.
Senator Mayfield also says SB 49 will, quote, certainly harm children who will no longer feel safe talking to trusted teachers or coaches.
We also invited Democrat lawmakers to be a part of this roundtable, but they had scheduling conflicts.
News 13's Jennifer Emmert recently sat down with U.S. Representative Chuck Edwards.
She asked him what he's hearing about the laws from people living here in Western North Carolina.
Are you hearing from constituents about transgender legislation?
I hear from constituents regularly that there is a resistance to having those ways of life forced upon the general public. Bureaucrats should not be deciding the values that should be taught in schools. Those are decisions that should be taking place in the household.
2 North Carolina parents plan to do whatever they can to get their child gender-affirming care.
This follows the recent ban on care for trans kids, and I also learned these parents are not done with their fight. This picture shows Amanda and Josh Dumas smiling with their children, one of whom is a transgender boy, Michael.
There were signs at the age of 2 when he asked to go by a different name. He was always drawn to more masculine things, and we kind of laughed about it and shrugged it off.
But before Michael went to kindergarten, Mom and Dad got serious.
Me and Josh, we went to counseling, just the 2 of us, and then they recommended we suggest a name or a nickname. Over that summer before kindergarten, we let him get a haircut. He started using a nickname, and then he started really presenting to everybody as male. After we got used to it, he became just a regular kid, a regular boy who wasn't struggling with these mental health issues. He was just a happy kid.
How is your 12-year-old son doing today?
So something you got to know about Mike is a lot of times when things bother him, the last thing he's going to do is show everybody that it's bothering him. He's a very tough kid.
He fully trusts his parents. It's a little pressure on us, but he fully trusts that we're going to make sure he gets his care, and we will. But it's scary for us.
Michael takes puberty blockers. The next step is testosterone. Michael is ready.
We have basically said, don't worry, we got you. And we do.
What was his response?
About going out of state on more road trips. He's like,
oh, yeah,
okay.
He's excited. He wants to get on a plane. Yeah, that's right.
That's because gender-affirming care is banned for trans kids in North Carolina. And it's still emotional for these parents. And then I saw you wiping your face. What was bringing you to tears during this interview?
Oh, I cry all the time. I'm an emotional person. It's one of my superpowers. I try to, own it, and, people know that I care.
Through overriding a veto, Republican lawmakers also banned trans girls from sports. But the law doesn't mention trans boys.
The bill's written in such a way that it won't impact them at all.
And Josh, you mentioned you've gone to Raleigh. What have you done in Raleigh? Have you spoken in front of lawmakers? Have you held protests?
It's only been twice, actually.
He explained to me what he told lawmakers.
You're hurting real people. and that there's trans kids in this state that will hurt themselves because of what you're doing. It's a guarantee. It's going to happen. The only thing you really have to decide is if you can live with yourself after this.
Buncombe County Commissioner Jasmine Beach-Ferrara, Allison Scott with the Campaign for Southern Equality, and Shanna Peele with the Buncombe County Association of Educators join us now.
And we've heard about many of these new laws. So how are members of the LGBTQ community reacting to these new laws? And we'll begin with you, Commissioner.
Well, LGBT folks live not just here in Western North Carolina, but in every town across North Carolina. And we are hearing from folks who are immediately impacted by this barrage of very cruel and discriminatory laws that have passed, and primarily hearing from parents who are worried about how their kids are being targeted and excluded from the health care that they need and deserve, being able to participate fully in sports and school. So there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of concern, people expressing what any parent would say, which is they want to do anything they can to make sure their kid has every opportunity to succeed and thrive.
Anyone else want to comment on that? On the laws and as a whole?
I just think it's, it's really important to remember that we're facing an unparalleled legislative attack against the LGBTQ community, specifically targeting LGBTQ children, and especially trans and non-binary children. This is the first time in many of their lifetimes they've seen this kind of just far right-wing group specifically coming at them to target them in their classrooms, the locker rooms, and now in their doctor's offices.
Let's talk about mental health. How will this affect the mental health of children as well as parents and the entire community?
I can take that. In our school systems, we're seeing that more and more resources are being poured into mental health services for our children more than ever. Especially after the pandemic, we're seeing that there are more children and families experiencing trauma. And so to have some politicians targeting some students just because of the way they look, how they worship, or the gender that they are, it really can add to the trauma and the need for additional mental health services when we're already experiencing shortages in funding in these areas, especially in our schools. With the continued defunding of public education and the increase of money going into things like vouchers, figuring out how our public school staff are going to meet the letter of these new laws while also maintaining safe and healthy relationships with their students and meeting the needs of an ever-growing mental health supports for our students is really challenging.
But what can you do now because of the new laws when it comes to mental health? What can you do to help students really who probably can't be out in the open at home but want to be out in school?
Well, the first thing that educators are expected to uphold is the North Carolina Educator Code of Ethics. And the very first part of that code of ethics is the sacred relationship between teacher and student. And so the relationship between staff and students are always going to come first. We are with our students so many hours a day. We get to know them very well. And so with that in mind, when you look at the legislation, specifically in SB 49, there is a line about whether an educator reasonably believes that the student may be harmed if they were outed to their parents or outed to families. And the educator has the right to address that issue by speaking with their administrators, with their school staff, and making a choice whether that student is going to be outed to their parent or not.
I think in addition to what Shanna's raising from the perspective of teachers, we also think about this as parents. We're all moms. I'm also a minister. And just think about what we know every kid needs to hear, which is that they're loved, they're supported, they're accepted, and they're adults who will be there for them every single day. And one of the greatest things we can do to support the mental health of LGBTQ kids and every kid is send that message and make sure they hear that message at home, at the kitchen table, in schools, in faith communities, on sports teams. That's again part of why these bills are so cruel and dangerous, is they seek to exclude a group of kids who are already at very elevated risks for depression, suicidal ideation, and suicidal attempts. They seek to exclude kids from exactly those places of support. So it's more critical than ever that we're all doubling down on something that each and every one of us can do, which is tell the kids in our lives that we love them, we see them for who they are, and we support them unconditionally.
And if you think about the purpose of that tenet in our code of ethics, that we're really fostering that relationship between students and staff, it's exactly that. It's to create welcoming, inclusive classrooms where students they have the freedom to fulfill their potential and to live up to their highest dreams.
One of the new laws specifically bans trans women from playing on school sports teams. So how does this bill impact the transgender community?
Well, I think, that is oftentimes how a lot of these legislative packages have been introduced, but we've seen that it never stops there. That's only the foot in the door to try to push through a whole host of bills that go so much further. Because we have to remember, in North Carolina, we're talking about an incredibly small number of trans, non-binary student athletes to begin with. We've never had an issue. We already had a high school athletics board that has had policies on this for years. But again, that's where it starts. But we have to look. This is a legislative attack that brings about a whole host of bills that doesn't just stop at one place. So we know that the trans community, while this one issue seems to be like such of importance, we have to look and see that it also comes with these healthcare bills and forced outing bills. It's not just one bill.
And how do you feel that it only targets trans women in sports? It doesn't say anything about trans men in sports.
Right.
Did that raise your eyebrows at all?
Well, as a trans woman, I can tell you, we are oftentimes have been depicted in movies and social media. It's always been this fear. Trans women are something to be feared. We're something to be othered. And again, it's the erasure of trans men. I just want to say that. Trans masculine people, non-binary people. It's the erasure of all that because of just trying to bring about more fear-mongering by a small group of right-wing legislators who, again, want to take one group of people and then use it to demonize a whole host of people. I mean, what does that have to do with LGBTQ children who can't access health care and the struggles that them and their family are facing every day in their lives that we just heard about?
And then another law bans gender-affirming care for people under 18 years old. What kind of impact is this law having? Anybody can start.
This is having a really profound impact and causing a tremendous amount of stress for families all across Western North Carolina who have transgender youth. It's important to start the conversation by saying that every medical body that has looked at this question has found that gender-affirming care is the best and most appropriate treatment to respond to the medical needs of transgender kids. That's been affirmed again and again by groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics. And what we believe is that this is a set of decisions that should be made by parents and trusted care providers. And instead we have politicians forcing their way into the exam room and making medical decisions for families and restricting access that should be legal to gender-affirming care. And so we at the Campaign for Southern Equality are working with families across North Carolina as they now have to travel out of state, oftentimes to Virginia or South Carolina, to seek care that should be legal here. And are doing so at great expense and again under great stress. And again, this is an example of a group of far-right extremists inserting a political agenda and going where they don't belong, which is into the very private affairs of families and the private decision-making of parents.
Now, again, this was something that was voted on by most, if not all, Republicans in the State House. So are all of them considered far-right and extreme, or is it just the people who came up with the actual policies?
I think we can say that an extremist agenda is driving the legislative priorities of the General Assembly at this point, not just on issues related to LGBTQ issues, but on issues related to abortion access, on issues related to stripping our public schools of the funding and support they need. And it's of great concern because what we know, for instance, on LGBTQ issues is that the majority of North Carolinians across the political spectrum know and love someone who's LGBTQ, support marriage equality, support equality in employment and housing, and want to do right by kids, do not want to be part of cruelly targeting young people for the worst kind of treatment. So yes, I think it's very fair to say that the political agenda of the state legislature right now is in the grips of a far right and very dangerous extremist movement.
And if we could just go back to the healthcare access piece of it, I think, you know, anybody in the LGBTQ community will tell you that getting healthcare is never easy. You know, at Campaign for Southern Equality, we've worked on building out a list of healthcare providers for the last few years that people can go and access and know that they can get quality care. And it's not a big list for people in our area because, let's face it, this has not been the first priority of a lot of the medical community. And now we're talking about making that so much harder to get what was already hard to begin with. So the way these laws are written, it's really making this ambiguous problem for the parents, for the children, but also for the medical providers. You know, some medical providers don't know if they can continue care or not continue care. Parents are like, my child has been in care, can they keep their care? Now what do I do? And at the Campaign for Southern Equality, that's one of our biggest pushes, is going, here's what you can do where you're at, here's what you can do if you aren't there yet. So when we hear stories from families who literally have to drive 2-3 hours just to get across a state line, that's heartbreaking for healthcare in this country. That is where we have put our families in this position.
Let's go back just a little bit. Several of these laws are having an impact, again, on school life, and that includes SB 49, known as the Parents' Bill of Rights, or Don't Say Gay bill.
So, Ms. Peele, what are you hearing from local students and teachers?
Well, there's a lot of confusion around this bill. First, it's worded very vaguely, and secondly, a lot of what is in this bill we've already been doing in our schools for a very long time. Our parents have access to what we're teaching, for example, and if they have questions about curricular materials, they can contact their administrator or their teacher and ask for those. So a lot of school districts right now are really trying to wade through the bill, find out what they already have covered in policy and what they still need to delineate in policy to make sure that they're complying with the law. And while school districts will comply with the law and are required to, the trickle-down effect on staff is an additional amount of confusion and worry that by breaching the trust they might have with their students can affect the relationship in the classroom, whether students are able to access learning, if they're worrying about whether they're misgendered or whether they're safe at home for coming out to their families. And the effects on parents who may already know that their students are using a different pronoun than they were assigned at birth, or if they're using a different name than is on their birth certificate. Even those students and parents are experiencing exclusion and experiencing being pulled out of the classroom to have these conversations about whether they do want to go with a different pronoun. So we're seeing a lot of additional stress on staff, on students, in a school system across North Carolina that is really in crisis, where everyone is already stressed and at a point where they feel like they can't take on much more.
Also, I think, you know, you talked about this with staff too. This also affects everyone involved in these situations. I have friends who are LGBTQ teachers in some of these lower grades, and you know, they talk about this all the time. What if they accidentally slip up and mention their same-sex partner, what they did, you know, we went on a vacation for the weekend. Does that go against the bill? You know, these bills, this makes this assumption that it's a faceless problem. Well, the face is right there in front of the legislators who won't look at it. It's the students, it's the staff, it's the parents who are all LGBTQ, and they can't just make themselves disappear.
Yes, and in addition to that, there's the little tasks that add up. Our staff are worrying about the books that they've purchased with their own money that are in the classroom, and they're either removing all the books or covering up their bookshelves, and so it further detracts from that classroom environment when you can no longer have books on your shelf because you're worried about whether parents might consider that material that goes against the law.
All of these are examples of why, in our analysis, SB 49 actually violates Title IX under federal law. What we are asking school boards across the state and here locally in Western North Carolina to do is actually seek a clear opinion from the Department of Public Instruction about whether SB 49 can be enforced without violating Title IX under federal law. The highest standard that our schools need to be loyal to is federal law, of course. And under Title IX, you can't create a hostile educational environment for any group of students around issues of sex or gender identity or gender expression. And our very profound concern is that SB 49 does exactly that. And what we're asking the state of North Carolina to do, having passed this bill, is show its work. Show us the ways in which it can be complied with without violating Title IX. So at this point, the level of misinformation, confusion, uncertainty, and chaos on the ground is so great that we are elevating this and really asking for clarification at the state level.
Is the Southern Equality taking the state to court, or will you just focus on the Department of Public Instruction first?
Well, at this point, the Campaign for Southern Equality has issued a public memo that's been sent to DPI and is being circulated broadly with a legal analysis saying that SB 49 clearly violates Title IX, and we're asking DPI to issue an opinion to provide clarification. We have seen situations like this lead to litigation in other states and would certainly expect a similar course here in North Carolina.
Any kind of time frame on this, do you think?
Well, it's, as you know, Shanna and Allison point out, the clock is ticking. Harm is being done each and every day, and so we are urgently seeking clarity from the state and would urgently seek remedies under the law if indeed SB 49 does move forward.
And I know that, just so people will know, Title IX is meant to protect, women and girls in schools, not only in public schools, but also universities. However, I believe the federal government is scheduled at any time now to come out with new guidelines to make sure that they include trans girls and trans women. I don't know if that has happened just yet. There was a draft. And so when you say this law violates Title IX specifically, what are your main concerns when it comes to Title IX?
Well, under federal law and through rulings from the U.S. Supreme Court, we have seen recognition that sex discrimination includes and recognizes discrimination on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. And so that carries through readings of federal law, including those under Title IX. And our concern, again, is that this bill would create a hostile environment on the basis of sex. And as Shanna said, it's so poorly written that it can be interpreted in myriad different ways, depending on the discretion of an individual teacher or administrator or school board, and it creates just an intolerable level of harm and variability in our schools, when what we need to be focusing on is supporting kids, supporting teachers, and making sure that folks can be safe while they're at school and do the learning they're there to do.
And what do you think about the book bans that have been going on, especially with some of the books that have LGBTQ characters, like Two Dads and a Child, are being banned? What are you thinking?
Well, again, I want to pull it back to what we are expected to do as public school staff, and that's to create an environment that nurtures and cares for every child, regardless of their zip code, regardless of what they look like, and regardless of their genders. So if we want to have inclusive education that represents everyone, then we need to have books in the classroom that have literary value that include everyone. And so book banning is just another attempt at this agenda of some politicians to create divisions in our communities that do not serve our students and do not help us create an inclusive environment.
Are you surprised by where we are right now with all of it?
I am. I'm shocked. Historically, any group, when you talk about like banning books or singling out groups of people for different sets of laws, you know, historically, any group doing that is never really looking for all people to be treated equally. And I think what we're seeing with these kind of bills is we create second-class citizenship. And you know, I've said this before, it's really hard for me to believe that in our country's trajectory that it feels like this is a huge step backwards for us. And I'm just really saddened by where we are. But I'm hopeful at the same time that I see so many people coalesce. I mean, we talk about right here in North Carolina, we see, you know, groups of teachers, administrators, families. We're seeing across the state that these aren't North Carolina's values. This isn't our nation's values. And I think we're going to get through this, but it's also really hard right now. So it's important to let, you know, especially kids know that this is temporary and we're going to get through it, and there's people fighting for them and we love them and support them, and that's never going to stop.
How does that make you feel personally, knowing that some of these kids are being targeted according to the new laws on the books, where they can't be open and free at school without the parents knowing? Not that we're saying that the parents should not know, but just going off of this state law. How does that make you feel personally? Like, think of yourself as a child, if you're a member of the LGBTQ community. How does this make you feel personally, that these laws are in the books?
Well, it's incredibly cruel, and it makes you feel the way that cruelty makes you feel. Angry, upset, protective of kids. I think more than anything else, what we feel is protective of kids and wanting to do what every parent out there wants to do, what every loving adult wants to do, which is to have a kid's back and make sure that they know that they're loved, and that they're never going to walk alone, and that we're going to fight for them every single step of the way. It is an inexcusable breach of the duty of elected officials to be using their power and their platform to target children, and especially to target a small group of children, and especially to target a small group of children who are already at risk. And it's really important, I think, that as we have this conversation, we also talk about all the things that should be happening in North Carolina if we want to get serious about taking care of and protecting kids. Things like funding our public schools, things like addressing childhood poverty and hunger. The list goes on and on and on, and it starts in all of our backyards. So I think it's time for us also to call the bluff, and time for us to say all hands on deck. This is a crisis moment. This is a Category 5 hurricane. And it's targeting a small and vulnerable, but also very, very strong, resilient community. And this is the work of our lifetime. It's part of the work of our lifetimes. And you know, we are showing up to this moment. We're meeting this moment, providing direct support to young people and their families, to teachers, to send a very clear, resounding message that despite the laws that may get passed in Raleigh, what's going to happen on the ground and in our hometowns across North Carolina is that we're going to meet this moment with love and make sure kids get through this.
As a parent and as a teacher, I think this moment has meant for me a lot of what both of you are speaking to, and it's seeing my community gather around my children and the children in our classrooms and the children in our schools and tell them you're loved, and to reiterate how safe they are in our communities, and to stand up and say that the time is now for us to come together and to make sure that that message is loud and clear for everyone. It makes me feel hopeful for our community that when we come together, that we can stand up against this and that we can create loving communities for our schools, but for the community at large as well.
Perfect, and thank you guys so much for this fascinating conversation. We really do appreciate you. Now, in the spring, the Department of Homeland Security warned about the growing threats of violence and extremism against the LGBTQ community.
Let's take a look back at the recent rise in incidents right here in the mountains. In July in Haywood County, someone claimed a transgender woman went into the women's locker room and changed in front of minors. Those accusations later turned out to be baseless, but not before a contentious city council meeting.
I have 2 daughters. I do not feel that I should have to worry about a biological male being in a space where they would be undressed.
This is a plea to allow transgender folks to live in peace, to allow me and my family to use the bathroom like anyone else.
Also in July in Brevard, a drag show was canceled after police say a man used a fake account to make death threats on social media. The event was postponed, but a fundraiser later raised nearly $4,200 for LGBTQ rights.
The Jesus Christ of the Bible commands you sinners to go and sin no more.
And in May, a protest outside of a progressive church in Henderson County forced it to halt its morning services. Signs held up by protesters contained religious references and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric.
The new marginalized group is the trans group. All over the country, they're passing laws. We stand against it. It's not right. We have LGBTQ in our congregation.
Now, what do you think has led to the recent rise in anti-LGBTQ sentiment?
Well, let's actually flip that on its head for a second and first recognize that we see unprecedented levels of support for LGBTQ people, but we also see enduring bias and hatred that is being expressed through threats and violence. And we are living through a time when, unfortunately, that's part of what's happening in our public life. And it's a very real threat and concern that members of the LGBT community and other minority communities have to live with right now. Unfortunately, violence has been unleashed in our politics right now, and I think it's critical that all of us stand up and make clear that we won't tolerate that directed towards any community, including the LGBTQ community.
What can be done to protect members of the community?
Well, one of the things, I mean, we're already doing that in some capacity at the Campaign for Southern Equality. You know, when we look at this, we take a holistic approach that we are working for the lived and legal equality. So we know you can't have one without the other. So practically that means helping to keep people in care, allow families to have those options and to let them know that, you know, there are ways available still that they can keep accessing that. But then also working to put out things like this memo to you know, our educators, our Board of Education, to let them know that a lot of this stuff isn't legal already. So that's the tack that we take.
The other thing, though, is to connect the dots. And it's critically important to connect the dots between things like the 3 bills we've been discussing and the rise of violence and extremism targeting the LGBTQ community. Laws have a teaching effect. And when elected officials and politicians use a bully pulpit to target and bully and demean a group of people, it sends a message loudly and clearly. And some people who hear that message interpret it as permission structure to use violence and threats. And it's critical that we connect those dots and that we denounce it every step of the way. The political extremism that shows up in a bill like SB 49 or HB 808, and the violence and threats that we've been seeing throughout the mountains and throughout the state and country in recent months.
And it sounds like you were talking about someone who's running for governor as well, it seems, when it comes to a Republican candidate who is very vocal on anti-LGBTQ issues.
Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, currently running for governor, has a long and demonstrated track record of abusing the power of his platform to target different groups, the Jewish community, the LGBTQ community. And it's incredibly concerning and I think needs to be called out and needs to be challenged. Absolutely, we can have debates about issues, and we should be having debates about issues, but it stops when you start bullying, when you start being cruel, and when you start doing the kinds of things that can incite threats and violence that pose a very real threat to people living across our state.
Also, I would say that it's incredibly troubling that any politician so callously and recklessly puts out bills like this and the kind of language that they're putting out without considering the people in their own state and how it's going to impact them. And it really makes me wonder, you know, who are they trying to appeal to here? Because I think the message is clear that they're trying to create second-class citizens out of a lot of people in these communities. So we can't let that happen, and we're not going to let that happen.
Thank you guys so much. And that concludes our roundtable, and we'd like to thank everyone for participating, of course.
Yes, thank you so much for coming in. And if you missed part of the roundtable, you can, of course, find the very full version on our website, WLOS.com. Have a good night.